ענני במרחב ימים המיצר קראתיה ענני במרחב
אחת שאלתי מאת אדוני, אחת שאלתי אותה בקש, אחת שאלתי מאת אדוני, אחת שאלתי אותה בקש, שבתי שבתי בבית אדוני, שבתי שבתי כל ימי חיי, שבתי שבתי בבית אדוני, שבתי שבתי כל ימי חיי, לחזות בנועם אדוני, בנועם אדוני, ובקר בהיכלו, בהיכלו, לחזות בנועם אדוני, to gaze upon the beauty of Adonai. One thing
Welcome back to those who are joining us and has been with us throughout the day. And thank you for those who are joining us just now, and welcome from around the world and here in New York City. We're happy that you're joining us today just before the prayer of Ne'ilah. It's Yom Kippur afternoon. We will soon hear the shofar and we will be sealed in the book of life. Just before we do that, we want to continue working on our relationship maintenance with each other, with ourselves, and with God. To prepare for this day, many of us has asked forgiveness from our friends and family, and in this holy day, we afflict our souls throughout different customs, including praying and fasting, but we know that is not enough. We have to commit to change our behavior, especially in a day like this, in a year like this, that our world seems more broken than ever. Outside, the virus is still out of control, economic distress, and social unrest, together with the unfortunate death of RPG last week. I'm so glad that we are here today as a community to look at what we have to change. We're joined by a guest speaker, Vadim Blumin, an Israel activist and a change maker. And I'll soon introduce him. But first, I want to introduce myself. If we haven't met already, my name is Karin Lagziel, and I'm the Upper East Side Shlicha for Emissary for Israel. I've spent the last 2 years here in New York City working to create relationship between our Jewish community here and our Jewish community in Israel. For this special edition of Yom Kippur, I'm honored to be talking together with Vadim Blumin, my partner and dear friend, who's dedicated his life to building bridges within and outside of the Jewish community. Vadim, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here today.
Good afternoon, Karin. Thank you for having me.
So before we'll dive right into it, I want to read a little bit of Vadim's bio so we know who we're talking to today. So Vadim is an educator and a social activist, currently the director of the Mandel Program for Excellence at the Jewish Agency for Israel. He was formerly a content and training specialist at Makom, the strategic contact unit of the Jewish Agency. He headed its education department in St. Petersburg, Russia. Prior to that, he was the executive director of 1+1, Association of Immigrant Youth, a non-profit and by and for Russian-speaking teens and young adults, focused on leadership and community development alongside innovative frameworks for youth at risk throughout Israel periphery. Vadim is also an alumni of the Gvanim Program for Pluralism and Leadership, as well as the JDC ELCA Institute for Leadership and Government Training Program for NGOs Director Generals. He's one of the founders of Generation 1.5, Russian-speaking Israelis, that we'll speak about a little bit later, a board member of the New Israel Fund and of Be Free Israel, Israel Chofshit, progressive movement. Vadim lives in Ramat Gan with his husband Roman and their daughter Danielle. So again, thank you for joining us today, Vadim. I want us to get us started by letting you introduce yourself a little bit to our community and tell us a little bit your introspection about yourself. Before we start, I'll just mention that we're going to divide this conversation to three parts. We're going to start with introspection, we're going to continue with forgiveness, and we're going to end with chaos and the creation, our creation, by the image of God. Vadim?
Wow, Karin, thank you so much for this introduction. Yeah, so if we're talking about introspection, forgiveness, and chaos, it's interesting. I think questions of identities and my identities and the way I understood myself and how those identities play out started very early. I usually introduce myself as being born last century in country not existing anymore, which sometimes is, curious or fun, but it's important to understand that as a kid, and I made Aliyah with my family when I was 11, when as a kid you understand that countries can disappear, right? Soviet Union, there was a huge empire, the biggest country in the world, and it just collapsed, and it disappeared not because of external enemy was firing missiles at it, right? Something inside the Soviet society, the ethos, decayed, collapsed. And when you understand that as a kid, I think that the design and influence enormously me. And I believe that many of the things, or almost all the things I do in my day job at the Jewish Agency, in my volunteer and activism, when I'm not paid salary by the Jewish people, is actually designed to make sure that it won't happen again in Israel. I must say that if you ask me like my identities and stuff, I think for me the first and most important identity was being a Jew, and it was quite exciting. I remember even in elementary school, as I said, I made Aliyah. I came to Israel with my family when I was 11. I just finished 5th grade. And at the beginning of that year, I remember a friend of mine, her name was Katya. I won't say her family name, who knows where she is now. So Katya one day came to me and said, listen, you shouldn't come tomorrow to the school. And I asked her why, and she told me that tomorrow her father and his friends are organizing a pogrom. Now, this was so exciting. I ran back home. I told my parents, and they said that, of course, no one will scare us away. I realized it's my father, he was cleaning his gun, and my mom were actually preparing this. Karin, there's almost like a butcher knife when you have a small handle and the knife itself is bigger. My baby sister back then was 3 years old, and there's those trolleys, and you walk and there's back pocket on the. So literally my mother hid that knife, that butcher knife, and they accompanied me to the school. And I remember imagining my mom taking the knives and slaughtering Cossacks or stuff. So being a Jew was exciting. I know that today when you say pogrom, it sounds so terrifying, but what it was initially, and we have to remember this is the late 80s. And so in Ukraine, when I was born, right, nowadays it's Ukraine. Back then I didn't have any Ukrainian identity. I think most of Soviet Jews, we became the Russians when we came to the States, to Canada, to Israel. But back then, we were Soviets and we were Jews and we were all kinds of identity, but there was no clear, but that's probably a different conversation. So back to the first initial understanding of me being a Jew, I think almost 6 months before we made Aliyah, there was a first Jewish school that opened in my hometown, Dnipropetrovsk. Don't try to say it. It's easy nowadays, they change it to Dnipro. Anyhow, so I went there, and I don't know how many of our viewers or you, Karin, are aware of the core assumptions or the pedagogy of Soviet education, but I assure you that free choice wasn't one of them. And coming to Jewish school, the first thing they allow us to do, they ask us to pick for ourselves a Hebrew name. Now that might come, this is an ordinary thing, perhaps in, Jewish day schools all over the world. But for me, as 11 years old kid, being able to choose, I must admit that actually I didn't choose for myself. I asked to call mom and said, Mom, is it okay if I call? But yeah. But again, still, it was a choice. And I remember being overwhelmed with joy by the fact that I could ask questions, and we were rewarded by if you could ask, the harder question you ask, the better student you seem to be. So that was overwhelming. And cutting a long story short, when we came to Israel, I actually asked to go to a Jewish school in Israel, and I still live in Ramat Gan. We came here almost 30 years ago. In November 26, we will celebrate 30 years.
Ramat Gan, just for our viewers' sake, is kind of in the center of Israel, not too far from Tel Aviv.
Yeah. And it's in a way, yeah. And in Ramat Gan, saying that I want to go to a Jewish school probably meant to the person in the municipality a religious school. So I went and I studied in a religious school. And I remember this is really fast forward. After finishing my army service, I served the IDF in the intelligence. I moved to Jerusalem to study international relations. And we had to choose another topic, and I hated history in high school. But I said, well, probably if I'm going to be Israel ambassador somewhere in the world, I should probably know some, stuff that happened in the past. So I went, and my secondary bachelor's degree was history and Jewish history. Footnote, I fell in love with Jewish history. My second degree and my research is actually in the history of Jewish people. But that's another topic for another conversation. Anyhow, going back, the first year, the first lecture, it's a huge room, we called it Ulam 300, 300 people sitting there. And I remember the classes for Jewish history. I was the only student not wearing or weaving a kippah, right? It looked like a Bnei Akiva branch. And it was very strange to me, the understanding that, wait, I felt the moment we landed, it was clear to me that this is my home. I didn't need, gatekeepers or somebody to give me permission. I felt as a Jew, as a new Israeli, and I felt part of this culture, of this history, etc. And I think this was the first main identity. So and until now, you see, I'm still a professional Jew. I dedicate my professional life to Jewish education, etc. So I think that was the first and most important identity. And as the time go by, others, I added others. Yeah. And, it's concentric circles of identity. But yeah, go ahead.
So actually, first of all, thank you so much for sharing and kind of telling us your initial kind of like the identity that you maybe wear on your shoulders, and that like jumps when you think about the topic of identity. If you do feel comfortable, I would love to ask of kind of maybe give us a little bit more of your journey and your journey with identity, your introspection about kind of on multiple identities and the parts that was formed within you.
Yeah. I think it was in the second year of my army service. Because of the nature of my service, I spent 48 hours at the army and then 3 days back at home. So I think the first month it was just fun, just lay down, watch. Well, back then we didn't have Netflix. I'm sorry, I'm that old. But I think by the end of the second month, it felt like, well, I have so much spare time. I'd like to do something. And I discovered in Ramat Gan, in city center, I have no idea how to translate Barzelim into English. With kids out of school, they're just hanging around. How would you say that?
I don't know, sitting and kind of like the places outside that just like in the streets.
Yeah.
I would say benches, but in a very different way. Like kids can play around and kind of just stay there for hours after school before not really doing too much.
Right. So anyhow, suddenly I realized, having my own extremely successful story of Aliyah. I was, again, the only Russian speaker in my religious school. We were embraced and hugged and loved by friends, new friends we made in Israel, family we discovered here. And suddenly I saw those kids who were younger than me by, not so much younger, perhaps 5 years younger than me, but they were out of school, just hanging around. And I realized that they have a very different story of making Aliyah to Israel. Nowadays, looking back then, I know to say that they were the definition of youth at risk. They were school dropouts. They lacked the sense of belonging. They felt that they were brought to Israel without really wanting that. They lost their friends. They didn't feel that this is a place that they'd like to stay or welcomed, etc. And so I think it was the first time that I ever explored my Soviet or, quote unquote, Russian speaking identity. And I think it's fascinating, I think the first decade of my life in Israel, I was making so much efforts to become an Israeli. I literally remember myself, even during high school, being embarrassed when my mom spoke to me in Russian in the bus. I was saying, shh. I was afraid that someone will know, right? My parents coming to, what, Asifat Horim. How do you call Asifat Horim in the States?
Parents, when the parents come to school and get kind of like the wording from the teacher of how we did.
Yeah. So, but only when I felt Israeli enough, probably, I allowed myself to be a Russian or a Russian speaker. And I started as, I facilitated that group just by myself with, I think after 6 months or so, I managed to bring the Ramat Gan municipality and the Ministry of Absorption to support. We just needed a place. And I think gradually the kids said that they are interested. And it was, classic work on identity, group building, empowerment, leadership development. And at some point they said that they wanted to become, to do a breakdance. You probably have no idea what breakdance is. In the 90s, it was a big hit. Never mind, I feel so old right now. Moving forward, and so when I moved to Jerusalem as well, I found more men and women like me, and we established non-profit NGO, and we worked for almost 8 years in 1+1 Association of Immigrant Youth, creating frameworks for and by youth at risk, mainly Russian speakers, but also some Ethiopian kids and young adults, creating partnerships with local Israelis NGOs. So that part, was suddenly became an important part of my identity and my journey. And I think the last one, if we, playing this concentric circles of identity, I think the last one was the gay part. I think both because it took a time for me to accept myself. It's funny, this conversation on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur was the harshest times of all. I take my prayers on high holidays very seriously. At some point, we moved from Ramat Gan to Bnei Brak. My parents bought an apartment there because it was cheaper, it was easier. It was the slums of Bnei Brak, Pardes Katz, for those of you who know. We loved that. My sister until now adores and goes back with sweet memories of growing up in that, very
So Bnei
poor.
Brak is a city that is known by a big population of ultra-Orthodox as well. It's very different than Ramat Gan, that is mostly secular.
Right, Ramat Gan is, mostly secular and traditionalist, and Bnei Brak clearly much more religious. And you have this, on the border between Ramat Gan and Bnei Brak, very poor old neighborhood that traditionally majority of population there were by Mizrahi, right, Olim who came from Muslim or Arab countries to Israel in the 50s, 60s. I have no idea how we got, I know how we got there, sorry. So I was walking by feet, it was almost 14 minutes walk from Bnei Brak to my shul, to my synagogue in Ramat Gan. And this was the closest and the harshest conversation I had with God. Asking him, or her, or them, why? Why? Because it was clear to me that I was damaged. I think partly of accepting oneself, especially when we're talking about LGBTQ plus communities, is that journey. And until now, I'm saying I'm a big believer, but I'm not a religious person, right? I believe in I don't know, the divine God. I believe in people. I believe in power of words, of ideas. But religion is a creation of mankind and mankind. And so back then it was I give him a peace of mind, the Lord Almighty, and asking and trying to get an answer. Why he made me that way, why was I damaged, etc. There's a beautiful story, Midrash, saying that the moment Messiah will come, there will only 2 holidays remain, because all other holidays will be dismissed. Do you have any idea which 2 holidays will remain?
2 holidays that, again?
When Messiah will come, all the holidays, כשיבוא המשיח, כל החגים יתבטלו, למעט שניים, except two. Two holidays will remain.
Two holidays. I want to assume Yom Kippur because we're in Yom Kippur.
That was an easy one. Yes, and the second one?
Is Purim the other?
Yes. Yes. How did you know?
I heard some of the story. I'm not going to ruin it for you, but I know some of it.
Yeah. So Purim and Kippurim. So at Kippurim we had this, harsh conversation. At Purim I got totally drunk. I don't think I ever was so drunk, and I was weeping my heart and also really yelling, "Why?" The same year, and 2 weeks afterwards, I met my husband for the last 18 years. So I guess some of the conversation worked. Probably he felt bad, or I didn't try to make a point. Anyhow, so if you're asking me the journey of my concentric circles of identities and my activism, not only internal identities and introspection, I guess this was the last one to acquire. And 9 years ago, my personal miracle, I think the best thing that happened to us, our firstborn daughter, Daniel, was born, and we actually used a midrash from the firstborn of Rachel, Rachel and Yaakov, who was also born through a surrogacy, right? Like Hagar before her, that was the first surrogate mother of the book of Genesis, and Rachel says, "The Lord Almighty judged me, he heard my voice, and he gave me a son, so we called him Dan." And in our case, we said, "The Lord Almighty heard our voices and our prayers and gave us a daughter, so we called her Danielle."
Beautiful. And it actually brings us in a very beautiful way to kind of the next part of our conversation, as we wanted to talk about forgiveness. And in our initial conversation, kind of before, we talked about forgiveness within the Israeli society and how different groups in the Israeli society might who do we as a society maybe need to ask forgiveness from. But before we even go there, I want to ask you, with your own kind of journey, did you forgive yourself? Did you find the peace within maybe the places that your different parts of yourself took you to different directions? As you're saying, kind of, you said it the best when you said, like, on the border of Ramat Gan and Bnei Brak, being there at that point, a religious kid that realized that he's gay, and
Yeah. You know what? I think, in a way, I think that's probably the best thing in being so old. I'm 41. I have to stop with this ageism. But I think, yes, I think with time, you learn, it's a hard work. It's a hard work. But if you do it well and you persevere, there's a paradox of, as deeper as we are connected to our roots, the wider we can open our wings. And so as an historian, as an educator, I'm trying to allow my roots to go as deep as possible in my family stories and our traditions, but also within oneself, right? With my identity, accepting and embracing the different parts, even when they contradict. And then trying to spread wide the wings and try to share the gifts that I was given. But you know what, if we're talking about, this borderline of being always a minority within a minority, being, Russian speaking, Jewish educator, gay activist, part of the progressive camp with the work I'm doing for the New Israel Fund and for Be Free Israel movement. There's another thing I would like to say about those, this identity politics. It might be a little bit controversial, but please bear with me. If Yom Kippur is a time of exploring and introspection, I think it's time we gave a better look on this identity politics. I think that for a very long time, and it was inevitable, it was important. I think we should continue this work. But I want to suggest and claim that it's not enough. Especially nowadays with the challenges, enormous challenges we're facing, all of us, in the global Jewish world, especially nowadays with the COVID-19 pandemic, in Israel, with Israeli society, politics, but the same, almost the same big questions with, United States of America and former Soviet Union. And look what's happening in Belarus and Russia and Brazil and Hungary and Poland and India, everywhere. I think it's not enough. I think we shall allow ourselves not only to ask who is in the room, who is talking, but also to pay attention to what people are actually saying. And I think we should work harder to invest not only in building our strength, right? Because accepting oneself and demanding to our narrative to be heard and etc. It's important. But I think in order to focus on power rather than strength, we have to move forward. We have to find partners and to ask not who you are, but what it is that you'd like to do in the world, what it is that you fight for. Because even if you, Karin, you are not Russian speakers, you didn't make Aliyah, and I can go on, that we're very different in terms of our identities. But if you believe or you would like to envision the future I'd like to have for my Daniel, for my daughter, for the Israel I'm dreaming about, the world we'd like to build together, we could be partners. We could work and fight together. And so I think, so if I have to introspect or to do that cheshbon nefesh about politics of identity, I think it's about we focus on power and the things we want to fight for and achieve in the world, rather in keeping on investing time in interest. Is that clear? Does that
It's clear in a very theoretical kind of way. I was just about to ask you, would you take us with that kind of realizations and understanding into the Israeli society and show us what does it mean for the Israeli society today?
Perfect. Okay. Nowadays, there is an openly gay minister in the Israeli government, right? His name is Amir Ohana. He's a gay father. He also went through a process of surrogacy. So in terms of identity, I should be, ecstatic. Finally, there's a gay minister in the Israeli government. So in terms of representation of politics of identity, it's supposed to be wonderful. But if we go and accept my suggestion, my call for action to say, let's focus on what it is that we want to do in the world, suddenly it's clear that he is actually fighting against everything I believe in. And he's clearly voting against, whatever our community as LGBTQ community fought for generations. In the last government, he was the Minister of Jurisdiction, Sar HaMishpatim. He didn't need legislation. He just could decide, assign orders to allow, to end discrimination, to allow equality for all, people, all citizens of Israel on level of, adopting kids, surrogacy, and all other issues that he didn't do. And so this is an example for me how, it's not just who he is, but actually what he does. That is also important. And I think we have to find a way to balance the two struggles, the two attempts to fight for. And well, perhaps it's also a question of, I went through that process of working on my identity and embracing and finding a place for myself. And so perhaps it's also questions of time or age or development of struggles and intersectionality. But for me, I hope and I wish that in the upcoming year, we'll be able to find partners, surprising partners in surprising places that share not all, but perhaps some of our values and our ideas and our dreams, and we will be able to fight together and to gain not only strength, but power.
Beautiful. And want to ask you as an activist and someone that really, takes matters in your own hands in many areas, when we're talking about the subject of forgiveness within the Israeli society. Can you share a little bit of how do you see it today, and where do we need to aim our efforts and in that realm?
Yeah. So I connected to my last sentence and then let's move further. This might work. Wrapping up this idea of, the next step of politics of identity. I think partly and I'm saying this as a part of progressive camp, I think we should try and be more forgiving. I believe that some of the obstacles we have in achieving and fulfilling our dreams and our vision, for the future of mankind, humanity, Israel and others, is that many, many times we are being purists, right? It's almost, religious purity, right? When someone is not exactly aligned with our system of beliefs, he or she automatically almost becoming an enemy, right? Our ability to disagree on some parts of, this puzzle, this future vision that we're having, is playing against us. And I hope that we'll be able to be forgiving in order to find those partners that I mentioned before. And if you, again, bring me back to Israeli society, I think there are two extremely powerful and empowering speeches. The first one was relatively old or late, by the President Rivlin, that was talking about the 4 tribes. And understanding that nowadays in Israel, there's no clear majority, right? For those of you who haven't read or listened to that, he actually saying that there are 4 big tribes in what we call Israeli society, right? There is the Arab tribe, there's the ultra-Orthodox, right? There's the secular, and there's the traditionalist, right? Now, it is very interesting to ask, wait, where's the world Jewry, right? Is this the 5th tribe? There are many other questions. Do Russian speakers and Ethiopians, are we part of the same secular tribe? Or some of us who are more traditionalist? So there are big questions and interesting questions, and if you have time, I hope you will explore that. But recently there was another speech, which was, funny enough, inaugural speech. It was the first speech that the member of Knesset, Tehila Nachalon, who's a colleague, a friend, she's remarkable. We had many wonderful opportunities to agree and to disagree. I remember our first public fight, and it wasn't really a fight, we were talking about being a Jerusalemite. She's a very proud Jerusalemite. She was working for many years with Nathan Sharansky and with as a representative of Jewish federations from North America, and an activist. She's really a remarkable woman. And in her first speech, she was talking very candidly, openly, sharing her concerns and even her tears about the fact that there is a sense of a verge of distinction. Almost, it was, like, when we talk about the destruction of our temples, she was talking about the political and social and cultural environment nowadays in Israel, almost as identical to those days before the Second Temple was destroyed. And she brought there a wonderful midrash, wonderful story from Talmud. When the 2 extremists actually meet and ask each other to help because they understand that it's gone too far, and none of them are really in control of their gangs. So if you ask me who should ask for our forgiveness those days, I would say that our politicians. It seemed to me that the new media, the technology, and the games are changed, and they act as if they were a contestant in a reality show. the more provocative, the less responsible they are, the more, the more hatred or divisive rhetorics they get more attention, they get more traffic. And it seems in many cases like it's their only concern. And it damages and tears apart the gentle fabric of our society. Well, and I, honestly, it doesn't seem that they're about to ask our forgiveness. So I think nowadays, as an educator, as an historian, as an activist, it seems that im en ani li mili, v'im lo matai, right? V'im lo achshav matai. This is our responsibility. This is our watch as emissaries for Jewish people, for Israel, for just human beings who care. And I think it's our responsibility to be aware of our words, how we express and what we are saying in different platforms, if it's social media or others, what it is that we do when we go out in the world. Yeah.
Thank you. So first of all, if you haven't watched the speech that we were referring to of Tehila Friedman, a new member of Knesset from Kahol Lavan, I really recommend it. There's translation in English, and you could find it online on YouTube. It's a beautiful speech about our need to come together for a brighter future. And it's a great transition to actually talk about within all this chaos.
Yeah. Please forgive me. Just say, I think one of the powerful things, because I was so swept away by the Agadah in the story, one of the powerful messages she has that no one is going to disappear. No one is going away. I think partly our the disagreements that we have, sometimes when people talk, it's like as if we would wish the other person that we in disagreement with to disappear. If only they wouldn't be there, everything would be perfect, right? But no one in
who's winning, who's losing.
Exactly. We have to stop thinking in zero-sum game, and we have to be able to find win-win solution, and understand that we have to work together for the sake of the future of our children.
Thank you so much. It really sums the subject of forgiveness as there is no one tribe that has to ask for forgiveness from another. There's a kind of a mutual responsibility and a forgiveness that has to be done between people and for individual and for communities to one another. So I would like to ask you, and I would like to move to our final topic for today, which is how do we take all this chaos and how do we move into the creation of ourselves in the image of God, and your work in regarding to that, finding and showing people that they were created in the image of God.
Yeah. All right, so let's keep on. I'll start with the abstract and metaphorical, and then you bring me back to the earth, all right? I think that suddenly, it happened when I read a wonderful book by a professor, Rabbi Dalia Marx. I think the recent days reading quotes and articles and interviews of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and going back to an essay of Hannah Arendt from 1955 that's called Men in Dark Times. Because it seems that we are in a chaos, in unprecedented chaos that almost, questioned every core assumption that we had about human relationship, connection between us, holidays, how do we daven, how do we go to work, how do we learn, can we meet our elders? Like it's overwhelming. And suddenly at Dalia Marx's book, she has this article about chaos and suggesting that actually we've been through this before. And if you think, Rosh Hashanah, this is one of the 4 beginning of years, right? It says that in Jewish calendar, the Hebrew calendar, we have 4 beginnings, right? There's the Rosh Hashanah, we have for the trees, and there's for king, etc. So this is only one of them. Tishrei itself, the Hebrew month that we're in, is actually a name in Babylonian calendar, etc. And it's said traditionally that this is the day we celebrate Rosh Hashanah on the day that the first human being was created, right? Briyat Adam. And that brought me back of thinking about the creation and understanding that this what was there, and we faced that in a way, because every day, if it started with the chaos, the Tov Vavoh, the greatest chaos, God beginning to bring order in this chaos. And it's done by naming. Actually, there's no land or earth or water or day or night or stars, but only when the name is given to it, right? Vaikra, yeah, God gives the name. Naming things almost creates them. Our ability to call things by their name. And perhaps the fact that it's said that we are created in the image of God, bedmuto betsalmo, or actually in plural, bedmutenu betsalmenu, right? It's said in the original story. Maybe we have that ability to bring order into chaos. And perhaps part of our ability to do so is by calling things by its name. Calling the things that are difficult and tough and sometimes frighten us, and calling the things that perhaps we enjoy, find rewarding, and understanding that this is perhaps our purpose, to bring order in this chaos of life, of this world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And it didn't start with, COVID-19. We part in this VUCA crazy world for some time, right? And perhaps this gift of Yom Kippur, of stopping everything and saying, let's just stop, contemplate, introspect, explore, look inside and outside. Maybe this is a very powerful moment for us all to remind ourselves this unique ability to bring order in this chaos. Back to earth, Karin, right now, examples of how that, yeah?
Always. I love when you talk about the big concept and the big ideas, but I also love when you bring them back to, the Israeli society and your own life.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. Of, when we established in 2011, Generation 1.5, right? This is after I came back as an emissary from St. Petersburg, Russia, where we were actually the first gay couple that the Jewish Agency have ever sent as an emissary anywhere in the world, which a title that I like, I've grown to like with years. We came back, and if you recall, in 2011, it was the year of the Rothschild Boulevard protest, right? And the Israeli media was talking, where are the Russians? Why aren't they there? And
do you want to remind us what protest, for our viewers, the reason of the protest? We're talking about the high prices of living in Israel at the time.
Yeah, and people were actually taking their ohalim, their tents, they were living there. There were all kinds of circles of discourses and lectures, and so it was huge demonstration, the biggest demonstration, I think, in generations that went on in Israel. And we met there Russian-speaking kids that grew up in Israel. We already met each other, not only at Mount Sinai, but literally in Jewish Agency camps in the former Soviet Union, in the NGOs that we work together, etc. And we realized that we belong there, but we are a little bit different. And so the bravest thing we did is to open a closed group on Facebook. We called ourselves Generation 1.5. By the way, it's a sociological American term. The idea, the understanding of American sociologists were that the first generation of immigrants are paying the highest price for immigration, right? They're losing the social economic status. Usually they cannot regain the understanding of nuance of the culture. But our kids, they will say, they will be, and you fill the blank, right? They will be Australian, they will be Canadian, they will be American, they will be Israeli, right? And so American sociologists claim that, well, that's not exactly the case if the kids who are moving with their parents are in elementary school, right? But Sefer Yisodi. And I was 11, right? So this explains in a way, sociologically, psychologically, how come it's clear to me that Israel is my home, Hebrew is my home, but I still insist that my daughter will speak Russian. My name is still Vadim, even though I kept my Hebrew name. And so yeah, so we half and half. We are not we're no longer embarrassed by our country's origins. We don't see it as something to be ashamed of, but rather something that is a source of our pride and our roots, as we discussed before. And so I feel that in many cases we're talking about almost 1.5 million Russian speakers in Israel. And very high percentage of Russian-speaking Jews who are deeply committed, have very powerful Jewish identity. Their decision to live here is a very aware one. But many of us don't have and cannot exercise our civil rights here, cannot get married, cannot be buried. I think one of the things that actually pushed us out from being in this closed Facebook group was in 2013, in the Independence Day. There was a soldier, his name was Eugene Tolochko. And there's a tradition that on the eve of the Independence Day, right, is the Yom HaZikaron, the memorial of for the fallen soldiers. And the tradition is that the head of IDF, the head of Israeli army, goes and pays the last respect for the last fallen soldier. And that year, the last fallen soldier was Eugene Tolochko, Zhenya Tolochko. And he wasn't halachically Jewish. And he was buried outside the fence, and the head of IDF didn't pay him the last respect. Now, this act has nothing to do with the Israeli rabbinate or the military rabbinate. Just someone in his office thought that perhaps he's better go to a kosher tomb. And we felt that this is unbearable. This kid, 18 years old kid, paid the highest price for this land, for this country. And this country couldn't even pay him the last respect. So I think it's something that we're still fighting for. By the way, part of our group of Generation 1.5 actually went there and paid him the last respect, put a small flag of Israel on his tomb. And this photograph exploded all over Israeli new media, old media, traditional media.
I remember it very well.
And you know what? Israeli army changed its regulations. I don't know what has to happen in order for American army to change its regulation, but Israeli army did. And same thing happened when one of our activist group, Jennifer, went out and told the story of sexual harassment while she was in mikveh, finishing her giyur, her conversion. 3 men entered when she was, etc. I don't want to go into details, but what happened is that her parents started receiving phone calls that were threatening to annihilate her conversion, which is halachically impossible. B, more and more women went and felt, were courageous enough to tell their story. And 3, she was got amazing support by the religious Zionists, especially women in religious Zionist movement like Malka Piotrkowski and others. And so it seems that, I don't know, if we're talking about chaos and fighting for injustice, fighting for our civil rights, or even if I think about Israel Chofshit, right? I'm moving to more happy solutions. The fact that many of Israelis cannot or wouldn't get married through a rabbinate because of its monopoly, right, over marriage. I don't know if our viewers are aware of it, but Israel is, I think, the only Western or democratic country that has the only possibility we have to get married is through a religion institution, right? There's no civil marriages. So only if you're Muslim, marry a Muslim. If you're Christian, marry a Christian. If you're Jew, marry a Jew. But you have to prove us that you are good enough Jew in the rabbinate. And it's outrageous. I won't go into details, but one of the things that Israel Chofshit, Be Free Israel, does is wedding ceremonies. And I'm lucky enough, I think until now, I helped organize dozens of ceremonies. And I think this is partly what we as, created in the image of God can do, is bring that order to that chaos, whether you call chaos the pandemics or injustices or balagan that's happening on political, civil level. We have that power, we have that human agency. If we are able, let me use that naming, right, giving names, let's call it storytelling, right? If we are able to tell our story, and it's not as simple as it sounds, to do that work and to realize what are the stories that are important for us to be told, what are the stories that we're willing to fight for, right, together. And the moment you say it to the world, to your neighbors, to your partners, something happens in the world, and it brings more order, more justice, or it's a Hasidic belief, but it takes a very small light to
light the dark room.
To light the dark room. Yeah, I'm not sure it's a lighting the dark room, but yeah, me'at or docher bechoshech. Small light can task away big darkness.
Repel the darkness.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful way to kind of almost wrap our conversation for today. What started in kind of introspection and figuring out where we are, and who do we ask forgiveness, and where does that lay, and talking a little bit about the chaos that we have in our world today, and how can we bring that light to our broken world. What is our responsibility to create from the chaos? And I would like to give you, first of all, to thank you for this conversation. I would like to give you kind of like the last opportunity, if you want to address our audience today, just before we're going to conclude, and soon they will go to Neila. So the stage is yours if you want to say any kind of like wrap up or any last words.
I want to thank you for inviting me. This was a wonderful conversation. For me, at least. I want to thank everyone who joined us in this Yom Kippur, and I hope it was a meaningful one for you that allowed you to reconnect with your gifts and your inner strength in order to go out back to the world and bring order, power, or bring light into the darker corners of our existence. And going back to your question about our role, you and I were both, I came back from my shlichut, being an emissary in Russia, in St. Petersburg, exactly a decade ago, 10 years ago. And I remember how extremely important and deeply moving it was to find out that there are partners there that we can have conversation with, that care enough. It seems to me that all around the world, we are facing very similar challenges right now that has to do with our safety and security, with what, us and them, what does it mean to be us, who are they, how do we widen the definition of us and narrowing the definition of them, questions of freedom and democracy, and place, right, and the borders, whether it's Israel or America or others. And I'm deeply convinced that if we look and try to explore those questions together, we will come up with better answers. So it seems to me that in many cases, Jews and non-Jews, Israelis and people who live outside of Israel, that too much the walls of separations and sense that, well, I'm not knowledgeable enough, or I don't live there, or I'm not sure. I think if we care about each other, about the deepest values that we share, and we think about the future that we wish for, the next generations, we find that we have much more in common. And we must learn to be more forgiving and to engage in conversations. We might agree, we might disagree, but I think this is the only chance we have to make this world a better place together.
Amen. Toda rabba, Vadim. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for bringing your voice into our time together as a community today. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for our partners from the Jewish Agency, from UJA, the Federation of New York, and the Upper East Partnership. I wish you Gmar Chatima Tova, V'tzom Kal if you're fasting. And we'll see you soon. Toda.
Shana Tova, Gmar Chatima Tova.
Achat sha'alti meit Adonai, Achat sha'alti ota vakesh, Achat sha'alti meit Adonai, Achat sha'alti ota vakesh, Shivti, Shivti, beveit Adonai, Shivti, Shivti, kol yamei chayai, Shivti, Shivti, beveit Adonai, Shivti, Shivti, kol yamei chayai, lachazot b'noam Adonai, b'noam Adonai, behechalo, lachazot b'noam Adonai, to gaze upon the beauty